Welcome back. You're watching The Globe here on SABC News Channel. Now, the United Nations Security Council meeting on Russia's invasion of the Ukraine has been delayed by about an hour. The meeting was scheduled to start at 10 p.m. tonight. Meanwhile, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has called on the United Nations to urgently appoint a mediation team that can help seek peace between the Ukraine and Russia. The United Nations Security Council is expected to convene an urgent meeting later on today on the war in the Ukraine. So let's talk about this developing story. We'll be joined shortly by SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease.
This mediation approach seems to be losing its effectiveness. I mean, we can see now the war that is going on in the Ukraine, and I would say that that conflict is a conflict that should be subjected to mediation, to negotiation, to engagement, because it is not necessary for people to go to war and have people getting killed, infrastructure being damaged as it is now. And it behoves on the countries of the world, particularly the United Nations Security Council. They are the ones who should be getting more and more engaged in a mediation process. And one does not see that happening. One does not see that full engagement. And it is this that I believe should happen to bring the hostilities to an end. That is precisely what needs to be done in that type of situation, because it is not necessary for people to die and to be killed when the option of mediation, when the option of negotiation and engagement is available.
Okay, now my colleague Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who's at the United Nations headquarters in New York, is standing by to give us the latest on this. So watching all of this intrigue, Sherwin, war is war, diplomacy being diplomacy, was quite intriguing for me earlier on watching the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson speak at length about the relationships between South Africa and Russia, how Russia supported, liberation struggle fighters against the apartheid regime. So what kind of position does this put President Cyril Ramaphosa?
Yeah, walking a tightrope, I think, in summary, it's a piece, all right. There is this historic relationship between Russia and the ANC in particular, and subsequently the democratically elected government of South Africa. And then there is South Africa's international foreign policy, which affirms the United Nations Charter, right? As a UN member state, South Africa is bound by the prescripts of the United Nations Charter. And so they have to, in a way, support the position of the Secretary General in calling Russia to answer in terms of its violation of the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, one of the foundational tenets of the UN Charter. So a very awkward position for President Cyril Ramaphosa. And also, I think, when he talks about further engagement and greater engagement in the mediation role for the UN Security Council, it perhaps he's thinking about the Council in a perfect world. But this is a Council that has 5 permanent members with a veto. You have Russia with a veto. Russia is an aggressor in this instance. It is a protagonist in this conflict. It is driving the conflict in Ukraine. And so, to call on the council that includes Russia as a P5 member that essentially can veto a press statement, veto a presidential statement, veto any resolution, really questions whether the Security Council is perhaps the best avenue for a greater mediation, right? Just think about the Palestinian question, one of the longest running conflicts, agenda items that the Security Council has been grappling with for decades. Look at the issue of Western Sahara. This is a council that is incapable, based on the national positions of very powerful countries that undermine the consensus that a council, a 15-member council like this, seeks to achieve. It's a question that I asked Richard Gowan. Richard Gowan is the UN director of the International Crisis Group. They're a think tank think. They advise academia, they advise governments of kind of, diplomatic avenues to proceed in terms of peace and stability around the world. This is what he said in response to the call for greater engagement from the Security Council that emanated from South Africa earlier today. Watch.
The simple reality is that Russia will block the Security Council from taking any substantive action over Ukraine. In the meantime, the US and its allies have been using the Council as a platform to criticize Russia. And we've seen Council members like Kenya being exceptionally critical of Russia's actions. So it's a space for public diplomacy rather than quiet mediation right now. For a long time, Secretary General Guterres was cautious, and probably too cautious, about engaging in this crisis because he didn't want to break ties with Moscow. In the last week or so, he's changed tack completely. He's appealed to Putin to pull back. He has said that this invasion is a breach of, the basic rules of the UN. The problem is that by doing that, he has offended the Russians. And so I think he's done the morally correct thing, but he now cannot really pretend to be an impartial mediator between the two sides.
So Tsepiso, Richard Gowan there provides us with an interesting segue from the Security Council to the good officer's role of the Secretary General. But the Secretary General himself has also had to defend the UN Charter in terms of the aggressive posture we are seeing out of Moscow. He has had to defend the tenets of territorial integrity, independence, sovereignty, the humanitarian consequences that emanate from war. Remember, this is a United Nations that was established in the aftermath of World War II. Its premise is essentially to prevent conflicts of this nature. And so the Secretary General therefore has to defend the UN Charter, but that then puts him in direct opposition to what President Putin and the Russian Federation is seeking to achieve in terms of its security needs, in terms of President Putin's re-establishment of Russian domination, certainly in that area as it pertains to former USSR states that got their independence around 30 years ago. So a very complex situation. The Russians have been very critical of the stance the Secretary General has taken. Guterres has also called into question President Putin's reference to genocide that is happening in the Donbas region. He has called into question their labeling of Russian military troops entering Ukraine as peacekeepers. Remember, peacekeepers are something very specific to the UN Security Council. And let's take you back to about 2003, 2004. Remember, the former late Secretary General Kofi Annan also called out the United States invasion of Iraq as a violation of the UN Charter. And he received a great deal of pushback from Washington, so much so that they tried to get him out of his job. This is what Richard Gowan says about what happened to Kofi Annan. Let's watch.
Historically, Secretaries General who have offended the P5 have encountered very, very strong pushback. And the most famous example of that, of course, is Kofi Annan, who criticized the US over the Iraq war, and that nearly brought his career to a premature end. I don't know whether Russia is going to try and force Guterres out over his behavior. I doubt it will go that far, but I don't think the Russians are going to help the Secretary General on climate change diplomacy now that he's been so tough with them, just to take one example. I mean, my own view is that Guterres, much earlier in the crisis, should have been involved more in behind-the-scenes diplomacy, trying to reach out to Putin at events like the Winter Olympics, where I believe they met, to talk about heading off this crisis. He has now done a lot in terms of speaking out publicly over what's going on in Ukraine, but maybe he should have been more engaged early on.
So what can we expect from the UN Security Council, right? They have this draft resolution that has been tabled. It was meant to be in session already. There are some delays now at SABC, but realistically, what can we expect from this process? Even if there is broad consensus, Russia still has its veto. So what the United States in this delay is seeking to do is to establish as much support for this resolution so that they can come out and say, you can see by this vote that Russia is isolated in its position. That appears not to be the case right now. We are hearing there's some wavering from the Chinese, some wavering from the United Arab Emirates. India is apparently not quite on board. And Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the U.S. ambassador, has opened up this draft resolution to be co-sponsored by any member state of the United Nations. So essentially, all 193 member states of the United Nations could co-sponsor it. I'm just going to bring up on my phone just a short, what the South African DPR, because I asked the Deputy Ambassador Xolisa Mabongo if South Africa would be co-sponsoring this draft. He just wrote back to me and said, we are not co-sponsoring this resolution. It does not say much about the need for diplomacy, negotiation of a peaceful solution. It also does not refer to the role of the United Nations Security Council. Also, the use of the UNSG's good officers is only mentioned in passing. So South Africa is not on board here, and I think what you're seeing now in this delay is the United States sort of recalibrating, seeking perhaps to adjust the language in this resolution so that they can get a broader consensus and more countries in support, Sepiso.
Interesting, the conversation you were having, Sherwin, with Mr. Gowden, particularly around what could be considered similar conflicts. You mentioned the issue of Western Sahara, the Russians earlier on fending off their involvement in Yugoslavia. But there have been, observers who have said, you mentioned in your conversation with Peter yesterday that if it goes down to the General Assembly, it'll be a true test of either morality of where countries really stand, because there are those who have said America itself would then need to defend its very own similar action in the Falklands if what it did in Cuba is anything to go by, Afghanistan and Iraq. So is it just about the wording, or is there a sense of hypocrisy, as some have said? We heard earlier on a French presidential candidate say the West is really guilty of not ensuring that Russian security concerns are addressed at NATO, and that they too ought to take some responsibility.
Yeah, look, these scenarios, as they play themselves out, really becomes a he said, she said, or he said, he said scenario, right? The Western nations will argue that they have left the diplomatic track open. That continues to be the case despite the imposition of these sanctions that are based on the incursion of Russian troops into Ukraine. But what we often hear in these big geopolitical discussions is whataboutism, right? So if you are now talking about and trying to resolve the Ukraine issue, you then bring up NATO's bombing of Libya in 2011 that led to the ouster of Muammar Gaddafi, the fallout of which we are still seeing in terms of the instability that has proliferated West Africa now, and the coups as a result of that, and the trajectory of those decisions. So it's very complicated if you are going to bring up Yugoslavia and Cuba, if you're trying to deal with the situation in Ukraine. You understand, particularly from the Ukrainians' perspective that are fighting these battles on the ground and worrying for their country. We are hearing from the United Nations that as many as 5 million people from Ukraine could become refugees if this conflict goes in a direction certainly that no one here would like to see. We are talking about 3 million people that already in Ukraine needed humanitarian support in the eastern Donbas region on both sides of the contact line. Remember, there was a ceasefire line between those separatist republics of Luhansk and Luhansk and the other one that escapes me now, Donetsk, excuse me. And so there are humanitarian needs that are going to be exacerbated by the inability of member states of the United Nations to get onto the same page. And unfortunately, those historic relations, we talked about the historic relationship between South Africa and Russia. Russia has relations with a number of countries. They've drawn closer to China as China has drawn further away from the United States. All those historical positions come to bear when you're trying to resolve a conflict, and that complicates the ability to reach consensus in fora like multilateral fora like the General Assembly or the United Nations Security Council because of those national positions that tug you this way even though you want to go that way.
All right, Sherwin, we certainly are going to stay with that and with you as and when that Security Council meeting gets off to a start, and hopefully there is a conclusion that we are able to check in with you on. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, my colleague at the United Nations headquarters in New York, that meeting delayed, he says, mostly as a result from reports of United States concerted efforts to isolate Russia.